Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our fifth meeting. Let me introduce our guest speaker, Elisabeth Braw. She's a truly international figure, as you've read in her biography. Citizen of Sweden, university in Germany. She lived in the USA, lived a long time in the United Kingdom, so she understands the foibles of this country and its residents. And as you've seen, amongst her many accomplishments, she's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, with her work focusing on defense, national security threats, as well as the globalised economy. And the title of her talk tonight reflects the well-known book, best-selling book, that she wrote very recently. And you'll be able to meet Elisabeth at the Nantwich book desk at the interval. Please get along there and get a signed copy of her work. Academic, journalist, commentator, author, all of those things. And I've watched her, you know, we look at our speakers on YouTube very often before we invite them, and I saw that she did rather well holding her own in the bear pit of the Cambridge Union. So I do think that she'll do rather well in the rather pleasant atmosphere of Keele World Affairs, though I have warned her that in the Q&A, you do bowl some googlies. There will be some interesting, well-put questions for her to look forward to. But for the moment, let us welcome Elisabeth Braw and Goodbye Globalisation.
Thank you very much. The sign here, or the warning about mobile phones, reminded me that there was a time when there needed to be no such warnings because we didn't have mobile phones. Remember those times? Who remembers those times? I think most of us. But there was such a time. But let's get to that later. I was reminded also while you were speaking about once, it was a few years ago, I think probably 5 or 6 years ago, when I logged on to Twitter, which had apparently been down for 15 minutes, which was a big thing because Twitter, as it was then known, was a big thing, and it was not political. It was just where you went to get various pieces of information. And I saw that somebody had posted this. Chatted to my wife while Twitter was down. She seems nice. So it feels like we have left a very harmonious world behind, and now it's not so harmonious anymore. But if we think back to the late 80s, I won't put anybody on the spot by asking who was born in the late 80s, but I can tell you I was born in the late 80s and the early 90s. If we think back to that time, it was incredibly positive and hopeful, was it not? And I'll just tell you a personal memory. So as was just said, I went to university in Germany, and it was in the eastern part of Germany. That's where I wanted to go to university. And this was in the early to mid-90s. And I was fascinated by the transformation that was taking place. So that's why I wanted to go to university there rather than in the western part. And it was chaotic. But another fascinating part, as I discovered when I arrived, because I hadn't contemplated it before arriving, was that the Russians were still there. Does anybody know why the Russians were still there in eastern Germany in the 90s? Obviously, Germany had been reunited. Why were the Russians still there? But they were there. Sorry? Better coffee, better living standards. So who was it that had that excellent answer? I heard the voice. Okay, well done. So they didn't want to go back to Russia. That's why they were still in Germany. So when Germany was reunited in 1990, Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of Germany, negotiated a solution with Gorbachev because it was 500,000 Soviet, then Russian, soldiers in East Germany. There was no place for them to return to in Russia. The soldiers, the officers, knew that they were going to be housed in very Spartan and even inhumane conditions. And it's not as if the soldiers had a major say in such matters, but Such was the opposition among them to going home to Russia that Gorbachev negotiated a solution with Helmut Kohl that saw them stay in East Germany, Eastern Germany as it was then, until 1994. And there they were. So I saw them as a student. Everybody saw them. They were there doing nothing. You could see them driving around in their military vehicles on country roads and so forth. You saw them in town and so forth. They had nothing to do, but they wanted to stay so that, and then the Germans paid for construction of housing in Russia that they could then move to gradually, which is what happened. But that was the early 90s. The Russians, the Red Army was still in Germany with nothing to do. And that was the world at that time. Incredible optimism. And Russia was in no position to dictate anything. It could only hope that the Germans would agree to this solution of keeping these soldiers and just hoping that they wouldn't get up to any mischief, and it all went well in the end. And they returned, and we didn't think much more of it. At the same time, as we know, Western business people were going to Russia, they were going to all these other former Warsaw Pact countries, they were going to China. By the way, are there any business people here who were in business, helping their businesses expand internationally in the late 80s or early 90s? Okay, where did you go? Where did your business go? East Germany. Well, and what was the nature of your business, and where did you go?
Machinery. Farm machinery.
Okay. So, anybody else? Okay.
Bratislava to help the Slovak police develop more Western systems of the old militias.
Okay, so Eastern Germany, Czechoslovakia, which then became Slovakia. Anybody else? So two very different countries, and the reality is that back then in the early 90s, Western companies could essentially choose where they wanted to go. There were so many options because there were so many countries that were opening up, and I think we all remember that, those of us who were alive in the early 90s. All these countries opening up, obviously the Warsaw Pact, including the crown jewel Russia, China, which had been opening up for some time and accelerated in the 90s, but there were also other countries, for example, in Latin America, and back in the early 80s, whenever one country opened up, that was incredibly exciting for the business world, because that meant a new country you could do business in. All of a sudden, you then, in the late 80s and early 90s, had an avalanche of countries. It was an embarrassment of riches. And when I was writing Goodbye Globalisation, I spoke with, as you might imagine, a number of these people. What a time to be alive. I don't think we'll see anything like it ever again. So congratulations to those who were alive and were in business at that time, because the opportunities were limitless. And one of the people I spoke with was the CEO of Electrolux, obviously famous white goods company, and he went around the former Warsaw Pact, looking at various companies that he might like to acquire, that Electrolux might like to acquire, and there were so many different options, and he couldn't remember all the acquisitions he had made. But he remembered one company, and that was the Hungarian state-owned refrigerator maker, which Electrolux did acquire, and he remembered it because if you acquired this company, by acquiring it, you also ended up acquiring a zoo. Such were the times. So Electrolux ended up owning a zoo, which it then donated. But such were the times, incredibly dynamic and exciting for those who were involved in it. And that was on the manufacturing and sales side, but on the financial side, the same development was taking place. And I think we may all know somebody in British banking who went to Hong Kong, to China, to one of the Warsaw Pact countries during that time, because they all wanted to learn how you run a capitalist system, and our business people got to go and teach them. So it wasn't just a matter of going to these other countries to do business, it was also a matter of teaching these people how to run a market economy. We'll never have a situation like that again, where essentially a large chunk of the world opens up and wants to do business your way. You get to go there and do business, set up manufacturing, set up sales, maximize your efficiency, sell more, and teach another country in the process. What an incredible time to be alive. Then what we saw along that development was, of course, the development of the internet. And that's why we had that warning about mobile phones, right? So it is extraordinary that two developments took place at the same time. The collapse of socialist countries and their opening, and them and other countries deciding they wanted market economies. And at the same time, mobile telephony was being developed, and the internet then arrived and was being developed and expanded. All of that happened in conjunction with each other. And if we had had the East Bloc or the Warsaw Pact and other countries introducing market economy without mobile telephony and the internet, it would have been a completely different kind of globalization. And if we had had mobile telephony and the internet arrive without the Warsaw Pact collapsing and countries deciding to open up, that would have been a completely different digital world, mobile telephony-based world. But the two things happened at the same time and went hand in hand. One is inconceivable without the other. So if you think about the mid-90s, early 2000s, it was all very hopeful and optimistic, was it not? And life became very convenient. And it struck me the other day, I don't know when the last time was that I heard about somebody mending their socks. I mean, it was a thing, right? Before the late 80s, early 90s. You had to be careful with your things. Globalization and the efficiency of having having manufacturing in particular countries that could specialize in certain things, lower cost countries, and those countries then supplying the rest of the world with those particular products, has made us all so has created an incredibly convenient life for all of us, and has created an incredibly convenient life in the sense that we don't have to mend our socks, we can buy new things all the time, and we also have the technology that globalization has enabled and keeps producing at very low prices. By the way, who still uses a dumb phone? What is a dumb phone, you say? It's what came before the smartphone. Almost all of us use smartphones, although I saw you waved your hand. Well done, you. They are reliable. But there it is, a Nokia. By the way, who remembers Nokia? I think it may be a 3310 that you have, which was ubiquitous for a while, and it was ubiquitous not just for its looks, but for its ringtone. I think we can all visualize, we can remember it in our heads what it sounded like. It was incredibly annoying, but that's what everybody had. Then we got smartphones. What an incredibly convenient life. But there was a downside to it. And I think you have experienced it here in this area, that factories closed, jobs moved away. Who has any memories of factories closing and jobs moving away? Yeah, everybody. And that's what happened. And those who expressed concern about it were told, well, that's how it works. That's globalization. We all benefit from globalization. Those who said we all benefit from globalization, well, they were right. We all benefit from globalization, from this incredibly convenient lifestyle that we have acquired. But what they maybe forgot or didn't want to think about, those who advocated globalization, is that everybody benefits, but only some pay the price. And those some are the people who live in communities that lose jobs when factories move away, or when the factories are closed because the companies move their manufacturing to cheaper locations. And for years, I remember hearing about this, factories closing, and there's nothing you can do. Well, it's globalization. And nobody really felt responsible for the well-being of the communities where factories closed and jobs moved to cheaper countries. It was just, well, that's the way it's going to be. But people never forgot that globalization had let them down. And then in 2007, we got the global financial crisis, which started in the US. I was living in San Francisco at the time. It was exuberance of the highest order. So my husband is an academic, I'm also an academic, and San Francisco is massively expensive. So we decided we are not going to buy a house because we can't afford to buy a house. But people around us treated us as if we were total fools. You have to buy a house. And we said, well, we can't afford to buy a house at these prices in San Francisco. And the answer was always, well, there's creative financing, meaning no down payment, interest-only loans. Well, where do you think that will take a community or a country? It will create a bubble, and then the bubble will burst, which is exactly what happened. And it was this recklessness in America that created a financial bubble that then burst in America, but as we know, affected all of us around the world. And that created resentment against bankers. Bankers had been sort of maybe the most famous participants in globalization. All of a sudden, they were the villains in our countries. I hope there are no bankers in the room, but you don't need to wave if you are a banker. But the financial crisis really created massive resentment, did it not? So resentment at home among ordinary citizens, but what it also did was create among Chinese officials doubts about the wisdom of a US-led financial order. And because China was affected by this global financial crisis too, even though there was no housing bubble, or I should say mortgage bubble in China. China was affected just like everybody else. And that started creating doubts among Chinese officials about the wisdom of being so closely linked to a global financial system that was led by the United States that could pull everybody with it into a quite dangerous abyss. Nevertheless, in 2008, we had the Beijing Olympics. Does anybody remember the motto for the Beijing Olympics in 2008? No? I'll tell you what it was. One world, one dream. That's was the world in 2008. And it kept going for a while. Everything seemed to be working well. But when I started thinking about the health of the globalized economy was when I started hearing from business people around 2013, 2014, that they were having concerns about the conditions for doing business in China. Has anybody done business in China? Okay. What do you remember about the conditions of...
Varied an awful lot. It was changing very, very quickly. But the thing I've always felt was this feeling of mutual mistrust among business people and businesses within China. So they want to know who you're talking to. Always this feeling of fear of someone might get something over them.
Yeah. Okay, so a widespread atmosphere of fear among business people in China. Did anybody else raise a hand? Okay. What do you remember?
We were exporting to Shanghai 4 or 5 containers a week, and our partners there wanted us to establish a factory in Shanghai, but what they really wanted was our technology.
Exactly. So the prize for doing business in China was getting access to for Western companies, the prize for doing business in China was parting with some of your IP, right? So intellectual property. And back in the 90s, that was okay because Chinese companies were very rudimentary. They were not competitors, proper competitors. They were tiny, and their technological sophistication was non-existent. Ericsson, for example, went to China in the 90s, and the prize for entering China was that it had to cross-license with a puny little company of no significance called Huawei. Meaning it had to give IP to Huawei, and the deal was that Huawei would give Ericsson IP. Well, there was no IP to be had from Huawei. That was the deal. And Western companies, as you say, went along with it because they wanted to be in China. They wanted to manufacture in China. They wanted to sell to the Chinese market. And that worked pretty well as long as the Chinese companies were on a much lower level. But by 2013, 2014, they were getting quite good. I don't know when your company, if it started experiencing concerns about having to give up the technology. Did it?
We didn't give it up.
Okay, you didn't give it up.
And our partner, in the end, was prosecuted by the Chinese government and ended up in jail.
Well, you did very well. You did very well. Most companies just put up with having to relinquish IP, whether officially through cross-licensing deals or joint ventures, or because that IP was essentially stolen, which is, I think, what may have happened to your company. But by 2013, 2014, Chinese companies had caught up to the point that Western companies were concerned about having to part with so much IP. And that's when they started getting concerned about the conditions of doing business in China. It was not a level playing field. And some started thinking about maybe reducing some of their operations in China, but still it was so incredibly attractive. It was so incredibly lucrative that I think executives said, well, whoever succeeds me will have to deal with this. I'll just keep going for a little longer, another half year, another year. And that's what they did. Then, if you remember, in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, another seminal event in recent history. But most Western countries assumed that it was Russia being Russia. It wouldn't go any further than that. Western businesses kept operating in Russia because it was just another hiccup. But the excitement was gone about globalization. And as we have seen in recent years, the concerns have only grown. In 2016, there was another seminal event. I guess there may have been several, but one in particular in 2016. Brexit, and then another one across the pond. Donald Trump elected for the first time. And what those two votes have in common, electoral decisions have in common, is that wariness of globalization played a large part in it. In the Brexit vote, I would argue that the wariness of globalization turned into wariness of the European Union, the feeling of not having been listened to. In the United States, Donald Trump very cleverly took advantage of the enormous resentment that was in the Rust Belt and elsewhere vis-à-vis elites that have had closed manufacturing and moved it elsewhere without ever consulting the locals. And I think this is one of the key lessons of globalization. Nobody consulted the locals, and nobody was there to make up for the lost jobs. Now, some of the jobs were lost to automation, but many moved to cheaper countries. So 2016 was a really significant year when it comes to the health or support for globalization. And since then, globalization has deteriorated. Companies have become more and more concerned about doing business with China, or doing business in China, with China too, for that matter. Then we, of course, had COVID in 2020, which demonstrated in dramatic ways our dependence on China, and by the way, the speed at which globalization has allowed things, including goods, but also viruses, to spread. I think we all remember that it was a virus that began in Wuhan, but then spread to other countries because there were so many flights between different countries that people who had been to Wuhan flew to, for example, Italy, Iran, and so forth, and all of a sudden, the virus was all over the world. It would not have happened without globalization. It may have remained an epidemic, limited to certain countries, but it would not have become a global pandemic. Then, of course, the second thing that we, I think, all remember very strongly about the pandemic is that China refused to, well, we discovered that we needed PPE from China, which China then, in many cases, refused to deliver because it needed the PPE itself. Globalization wasn't supposed to work that way. Countries were supposed to specialize. China was supposed to specialize, for example, in the manufacturing of PPE that we could then get whenever we needed it. And we didn't want to think about the fact that China may decide to withhold exports. And that has become a theme since 2020. I first started thinking about what will happen if China decides to withhold exports, either because it needs the products itself or because it wants to punish us. The first time I started thinking about it was in 2010, when the Norwegian Nobel Committee awarded the Nobel Peace Prize to a Chinese dissident. Does anybody remember what happened? Well, the Chinese government didn't like it, so what it did was it announced all of a sudden that it had discovered mysterious organisms in Norwegian fish, and it banned imports of Norwegian fish. So Norwegian fishermen had become used to exporting to China. It was like for everybody else, it was a fantastic export market. All of a sudden, they couldn't export anything to China. There were no mysterious organisms in Norwegian fish. That was a message from China that if you, as a country, go against us, we will punish you by weaponizing globalization. And so that's what happened to the Norwegians in 2010. And the same thing began happening again in 2020. Sweden decided not to include Huawei in its 5G network, which led to boycotts of H&M in China, supposedly consumer-led boycotts against H&M, Swedish retailer. China Mobile also excluded Ericsson from its mobile network, even though Ericsson had been a key supplier until then. All of a sudden it was excluded, whereas Nokia, which came from Finland, which hadn't said anything about Huawei in its 5G network, Nokia got a significant share in China Mobile's network. We saw Australian winemakers being punished after Scott Morrison, who was Prime Minister of Australia, floated the idea that maybe there should be an international inquiry into the origins of COVID. All of a sudden, China imposed tariffs of 212% on Australian wine, which led to Australian winemakers losing their largest export market. So what companies it wasn't just Australia and Sweden, it was other countries too. Taiwan, for example, dared to utter an opinion about maybe there should be an international inquiry into COVID, whereupon China banned imports of Taiwanese pineapples. By the way, that led to an incredible response, grassroots response around the world. People created a hashtag campaign called Freedom Pineapples and started buying Taiwanese pineapples so that they wouldn't rot. So, what a time to be alive. But what became obvious is that China had decided it could use this enormously powerful role it has in the globalized economy to punish countries that took or said things it disapproved of, and it would do so by punishing individual companies. Now, that is a major fork in the road or milestone in the globalized economy, because globalization, the way it's supposed to work is countries can squabble, but companies are supposed to be able to float above companies are supposed to be able to float above countries. They are supposed to be neutral. They're supposed to concern themselves about business. All of a sudden, they were being targeted as representatives of their home countries. Well, how do you deal with such a situation as the CEO of any given company? You can't know whether your company will be the next to be targeted. So it was unsurprising that COVID and the increasing confrontation between Russia and the West led to companies becoming more concerned about the state of globalization, and companies trying to reduce their exposure to China, both to make sure that they didn't lose quite as much IP, but also to shield themselves against such repercussions. They stayed in Russia, though, until 2022, February 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine. And what was fascinating about the weeks leading up to that invasion was that the West imposed sanctions on Russia, thinking, oh, it's a globalized economy. Russia wants to be part of the globalized economy. If we impose sanctions, Russia will behave. And Russia didn't care. It went ahead with the plans for the invasion. It then invaded because it didn't care. Being part of the globalized economy was not Putin's highest priority. That's why he could invade. And the sanctions also didn't have the effect that we, the West, thought they would have, because the globalized economy had made other countries, non-Western countries, a lot wealthier, countries that didn't have the same strong moral concerns about the invasion of another country, countries that were willing to keep trading with Russia even though it was under sanctions, and that then kept trading with it even after it invaded Ukraine. Major lessons here for Western countries. First, that we are not the only powerful economies anymore. Second of all, the other countries that are now economically powerful have, as a result, become confident enough to have a very independent foreign policy that looks nothing like our foreign policy, and they will assert themselves. So they kept trading with Russia. As a result, Russia has been able to function pretty well despite being under Western sanctions. I remember vividly when McDonald's decided to leave Russia. I think you may all remember vividly when McDonald's was the first Western retailer to set up operations in the Soviet Union. Who remembers those iconic photos? Yeah. A milestone in the Soviet Union's transformation to some a bit of market economy, and then its collapse. McDonald's was there first. And then, when Russia invaded Ukraine, McDonald's once again called the situation correctly and said, we are leaving. And they left, even though it resulted in considerable losses. They left because they said, this is a new chapter, this is not just Russian turbulence, this is something completely different. They left. Many other companies left as well, but many stayed because they said, well, Russia is Russia, and it's just another blip. they have paid dearly for that. They obviously were concerned about making losses by pulling out of Russia. They have made even bigger losses by staying in Russia because it has become a very difficult country to do business in, and they also face complete arbitrariness when it comes to the nature or their continued ownership of their companies. As you will know, the Russian government has simply seized a few Western companies because it can. Who is going to punish it? That is the nature of the globalized economy today. So when people say, well, there is still international trade, yes, there is international trade, but globalization means that essentially the whole globe keeps trading on these very neutral terms. That world is gone, and it's gone because countries can't get along. It's gone because here in the West, our citizens got so concerned about feeling left behind, about faraway elites appearing to make decisions that benefited the elites and not the voters, that they voted, most significantly in the United States, for politicians, namely one candidate, Donald Trump, who favors a return to isolationism and is, as we speak, in the process of dismantling, reinventing America's engagement with the world, let's put it that way. And it also, globalization as a globe-spanning undertaking, also failed because it didn't work for businesses. It wasn't a level playing field. Some countries just didn't play by the rules. So here we are, and every day I think we wake up looking at our news apps to see what news may have emerged regarding tariffs, and we just hope that our countries, in this case the UK, that UK won't be the country that gets a 39% tariff like Switzerland did, and we also hope for some mercy from the Americans. In other areas as well, in what we are allowed to export to them. But there is no certainty because that rules-based framework that we thought we established in the early 90s is so weak that you can violate it with impunity. China has kept violating WTO rules for years. Now America is essentially striking out on its own. So it is a return in some ways to social Darwinism and very much each country for itself. But I think, in a sense, what this is showing us is that globalization, the way we set it up, which, by the way, it wasn't a sort of a book written about this is how to do globalization, follow step 1 to 100, and then you have globalization. It was people improvising along the way, politicians, bureaucrats, business people, and at some point they had created this globalized economy, but it wasn't comprehensively thought through because no one person was in charge of it. So some things were forgotten. For example, how to make sure that everybody is brought along. Another area is how to protect the environment. We completely forgot about the environment, about CO2 emissions, about climate change. That is a massive problem today, as we all know. And we also had a naive view of countries' ability to get along. I always think, when I think of international relations, I think of a sandbox and children in a sandbox. And they can play nicely for a while, then inevitably they start fighting, and an adult comes along and says, be nice. And separates the children, and they play nicely for another little while. But as we all know, there is no global policeman, so there's no country, nobody can come along and tell countries, well, you have to get along, and this is how you're going to do it. Countries fight it out among themselves, and that's what we are seeing now. And I think the surprise is that the United States is not firmly on the side of the West. And I certainly thought when I was writing the book that it would be the West versus some sort of a grouping led by Russia and China. It turns out it's Europe and then the Russia-China grouping, and then the United States pursuing its own path. But when I was writing the book, I also spoke with young people, because they will be the ones that build the next globalization. And what was heartening to hear from them is that they believe that there's opportunity for a second round of globalization 2.0, and it will be better than this round. So essentially we can incorporate the things that we forgot or correct the things we did wrong. We can do that next time, whenever that happens. It's not going to be anytime soon. But in the meantime, we live in uncertainty, and we live in with enormous nervousness, because here in Europe we are a part of the world that has benefited from the rules-based international order, from international trading rules, from countries behaving according to the rules. And now that that's not so much the case anymore, that puts us in a precarious position, but it's still, we can still be proud to be countries that try to do the right thing. And I'll just add one more thing, because I see I'm 1 minute over time. I'll just add one more thing. In the book, I spoke with somebody called Mo Ibrahim. Who knows who Mo Ibrahim is? British Sudanese businessman who made billions establishing internet telephony in Sub-Saharan Africa. That was also possible because it wasn't just Western countries and China in the form of Warsaw Pact and so forth. Globalization really brought virtually every country on the planet along with it. And Mo Ibrahim made a fortune on mobile telephony in Sub-Saharan Africa. And he told me an interesting story. Around 2004, his company was going to buy new gear for its mobile telephony network, and executives from Huawei, which by then was a powerful company and strong enough, sophisticated enough to be able to sell equipment to mobile telephony in Africa, not yet in Europe or North America, but in Africa. So they came to see him, and he looked at the conditions of what Huawei offered, and he said that he wasn't interested. And the chairman of Huawei said to him, "Oh, you're pro-Western?" And he said, "No, I just looked at your terms and conditions." And I thought that was really interesting, because he had looked at the terms and conditions and seen that in the long run, Huawei would be more expensive than Ericsson or Nokia. But the Huawei executives' reaction was that he must be pro-Western. And back in 2004, we were still thinking along the lines of a global, harmonious world. They were already thinking along the lines of Western or sort of pro-Chinese. And I think that really illustrates how we may have misjudged or been too optimistic about our ability to create a world where everybody gets along. But Mo Ibrahim also said another interesting thing about globalization. He said, "Nobody thanked us for it." And that really is the case. Nobody thanked the politicians and business people who made this really quite impressive system happen. I think because we began taking it for granted, and we noticed, after a while, we noticed everything that didn't go right. We noticed the jobs that were lost. We noticed the faraway decision makers. But we were taking the benefits of globalization for granted. So the next round of globalization will come, and it will include all the things that we forgot the last time around. And with that, I've gone 3 minutes over time, so I know I have to yield. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll discuss further later.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Q&A with Elisabeth. And I've just been reminded that there are some signed books and also the possibility of further dedications by Elisabeth when we close the meeting, none to which will still be there. So please join her if you didn't get the chance while you're having coffee. So we're going to start off with some questions. Not surprisingly, there are questions about the position of the United Kingdom in all this globalization. So I'll just give you the flavour of them, Elisabeth. Jeff Elliott, the UK used to make things. What could we make that anyone would want now? Hugh Gladhill, each country for itself. She quotes that. I think that's something you said. What hope is there for the UK, says Hugh. Treble Lyons, do you consider that the fiasco of Brexit will encourage the UK to reconsider the benefits of international cooperation and openness? Based on what you said, it's not a good time to think in that way. And then Pete Holcroft, as the global model fractures, could the UK be well placed following Brexit, or are we more economically exposed? So he's trying to be optimist about the freedom that we have as Brexit. We can pick on these questions, go back to them in a minute if you need. Yes, I'll stop at that point because I've got a more detailed question about the UK that follows.
Okay, so what could we make in the UK that anybody would want? That's a very British question. Why would anybody be interested in buying what we make here in the UK? Now is the opportunity for entrepreneurship. And when I look at certain countries, there is enormous entrepreneurship. Then in other countries that are not that different, you don't see a lot of entrepreneurship. And I don't think it is because people don't have ideas. So if I look at the UK, for example, I think lots more companies could be founded because people have ideas, but it doesn't seem like the climate is such that people feel incentivized to start companies. And so, for example, you have, in a country like Sweden, you have people starting companies all the time, whether it be a small company, selling, for example, I was in Stockholm the other day, I saw a new little pottery shop, or it could also be something like Klarna, which I think most of us have seen on various websites, the payment option that, buy now, pay later. That's a Swedish company worth billions. A new company founded a few years ago by an entrepreneur in Sweden. So I think there are lots of things that that people could make here in the UK. And now that people have soured on globalisation, on that they've lost faith in cheap goods made far away that may not be that good, and by the way, that country may not be our friend anymore. Now is the opportunity, I think, to make things here again. I'm not saying everybody would be able to afford the goods we might make here in this country, but you would have a lot more people interested in buying them and quite a few able to buy them. And the other thing is that people care about the environment. Shipping things around the world is incredibly harmful to the environment. We have just seen a few days ago the planned treaty on CO2 reduction in the global shipping industry failed at the IMO in London. I won't tell you why, but you can read about it in the news. So we are not going to see CO2 reduction in the global shipping industry, which makes it even more important to try to buy as much locally as possible, make and buy as much locally as possible. And people of all ages, but I think especially of younger ages, feel very strongly about doing that part for the environment, about buying local to the extent that they are to the extent they're able. So what could we possibly make? Well, I look forward to seeing a list with various suggestions. Maybe at the book table afterwards, I'll be keen to hear your ideas of what could be made in the UK. But I think lots of goods, and it's not because they are made necessarily in the UK that people would want to buy them, but because they are made in a sustainable fashion, they are made fairly locally, and that buying them doesn't contribute to continued harm and continued exposure to countries that wish us ill. What was the second question?
Yes, I'll come on to that. I just thought you may not have familiarised yourself with this region, but of course we are very close to Stoke-on-Trent, the pottery industry, which has been dramatically reduced in size to be replaced with international gambling as it seems to be its sort of principal industry. So I don't know whether you would recommend that a direction of travel.
Well, I could tell you what I would recommend, because where my parents live is in a similar region. more rural, but similar. And this region, the region where they live, is known for its glassworks, skilled glass blowers, glass sold all over the world, famous all over the world, sold all over the world. But in the 90s, globalization meant that China started manufacturing glass that looked just like that in factories, and it was much cheaper. And these glassworks had to slash their operations. These are highly skilled professions that carried the community, or glassworks that carried the community, and employing highly skilled workers, and all of that started going extremely badly, simply because there wasn't a market for it anymore. And as you know, once a major employer starts struggling, then any given town struggles to recruit businesses that can complement that company in that town. But what happened in my parents' village, it is really a village, was that a wealthy entrepreneur said, well, I want to invest in this glassworks. And he got a loan, the local town council guaranteed a loan that then gave him the reassurance he needed to invest there. He invested in the glassworks, and then he said, well, to bring tourists and others here, I'm going to also build a hotel. He built a hotel, magnificent hotel with live music. Then he built a spa so that people could spend the weekend in this town. Now he has built a sports arena and brought the best table tennis team in the country there. So it has become an amazing hub of entrepreneurial activity. So what I think what one needs can be sort of, I shouldn't say a modern lord of the manor, but something similar, who believes in the town and will, by the power of his or her personality, attract business here. So maybe let's scout around for people who could play that role.
Excellent. Stoke-on-Trent Spa. You've heard it here first. Right. The other part of the question was the awkward subject of Brexit, which we discuss in this meeting frequently, as you can imagine, I have done over the years. And so I think the question was whether, in your globalization context and with your external view, whether you think the UK is in a better position because it's got freedoms or may have learned some lessons, or whether it's disadvantaged in this fractured globalization environment that you've described.
You know, I was just having this conversation with my son the other day, who's a civil servant, and we were talking about the fact that the UK got lower tariffs, or was punished with lower tariffs than the European Union. So in that sense, it's good to be the UK, because the UK now has, UK companies now have lower tariffs on their goods than do companies from the European Union. On the other hand, so that is the upside. The downside is that the UK the only approach with which the UK can use vis-à-vis the United States is hope, because acting alone vis-à-vis the United States means one is in a position of inferiority if one is not China. Whereas the European Union obviously has 450 million people and can put up a bit of strength in its negotiations with the United States. So there are two sides to it, but I think, unfortunately, from a foreign policy and security policy perspective, if Brexit had to happen, it would have been better that it happened another time, not at the time just before the world became extremely unstable, well, what would have been the perfect time? Possibly the beginning of the 2000s, but it happened when it happened.
Before I put this question to you, because it might be a bit of a problem question, can I have a show of hands? Who has heard of the UK National Preparedness Commission? That's about UK National Preparedness Commission. I think less than 20% of the hands went up. Have you heard of the UK National Preparedness Commission?
Yes, I have.
Oh, right. Well,
I'm
the question there, you can answer the question then.
I'm a
This is
mem-
from Jeff Elliott,
Yep.
and he wonders whether, he wonders what this commission is the least prepared for.
So the UK National Preparedness Commission is a commission of which I'm a member. It was set up by Lord Toby Harris, who decided that the UK is not prepared. It doesn't talk about crises that can happen, crises having to do with the functioning of the country, not crisis as in financial crisis, but crisis concerning the operation, the functioning of the country. So he set up this commission and appointed people to it, and I'm one of them. What is the crisis the UK is the least prepared for? Well, I can tell you several. Power outage, drones at airports, internet outage, water outage, drones in other sensitive areas. I think the crisis we are the best prepared for is actually, well, it's two. Financial crisis, because after the global financial crisis, countries, including the UK, put in place various instruments to make sure that no such thing could ever happen again. So that's one crisis the UK is prepared for. Hopefully, now better prepared for the next pandemic, it will happen. And then another thing the UK is well prepared for is war. It is a member of NATO. It has impressive armed forces. And as you know, armed forces don't just exist. They practice all the time for the crises that they are there to get involved in, which is war. So the UK is prepared for financial crises, hopefully for pandemics, and also for war. But crises short of war, not so much.
I'd like to broaden it out from the UK to small countries and how they can rebuild. So I'll put the question to you in two ways. Sean King, does the decline in globalisation and rules-based system threaten the independence of smaller nations, and what do they need to do? Sid Goodman looks at it in a different way. How does a country set about rebuilding its economy when it's become so dependent on imported goods, particularly from China? So you can't talk about every small country on the planet, but you might be able to give us a feel for the struggle that many of them are experiencing.
Yes, we have all become used to goods from China, right? And I think those of us who were alive in the 80s will remember the first time that we saw or wore a product that said on its label, made in China. Who remembers that? Yeah, because it was a new thing at one point, and now it's just a fact of life. Everything is made in China. Remind me what the question was. I should take notes. I try to rely too much on my memory.
Well, it is impressive, but basically, global. How do these smaller countries cope? What do they need to do to cope with the extreme difficulties they have? And the answer might be different for an African country than it might be for a South American country or a smaller country in Europe.
It is indeed different for each country. So here in Europe, we have a number of smaller countries, and some small countries that have the same exposure to China. I think what we'll see is, especially within the European Union, but also within Europe more widely, increased effort to do as much business as possible within this part of the world, to not outsource as much as we did before. But what needs to happen first is that we have to have an honest conversation in our societies about the risks of the degree of dependence that we have had on China. Because if our policymakers don't articulate the risks associated with it, then why would anybody be willing to pay more for any consumer goods if you can have the same consumer good made in China much more cheaply than if it's made here or in the Midlands or somewhere else in the UK or Europe? So we need to have that conversation. As a society in the UK and elsewhere, this is the price we pay in terms of exposure to or making ourselves dependent on China, of losing jobs at home, of harming the environment. This is the price we pay for cheap goods from China. And I think that would convince many people that actually manufacturing at home is quite good and that prices have been artificially low, because that really is the case. They've been artificially low, and they've been artificially low because they were based on the idea that we could always have friendly and harmonious relations with China. And a few years into that arrangement, it was clear that China wasn't going to play by the rules, and now China and similar countries, well, China and Russia, are showing quite openly that they don't wish us, that they don't have our success as their objective.
I'd like to move the discussion into an area of five-letter word, which usually comes up at this meeting at some stage. It's to do with Donald Trump. So there's a variety of questions around Trump and what he's doing. So I'll give you the flavour. So we start off with Pete Holcroft, who insists this is a serious question. Is Donald Trump the next global genius or just a social media star who plucks numbers from thin air? So that just gives you the flavour. Chris Nibbs, he just wonders whether this protectionism that's been introduced is just a 4-year blip, as the underlying financial globalisation still rules, he thinks. Now, what does Julie say? Why don't world leaders learn from history, even recent history? So Trump's following the Trust playbook, but shouldn't his high IQ have alerted him to the dangers? And Pete Gray, what will be the consequence? Oh no, let's look at Alistair Duncan, because he's saying whether he's internationally, economically illiterate, because he says nations have traded for centuries, and he thinks that Trump economics won't stop that. So you can see the flavour. Is this going to carry on just for a short while? Is it madness? And will history overwhelm what Trump is doing?
So I don't think it's madness, but it is a complete rejection of facts. That is how Trump operates. You will see when he speaks, he presents various statements, sentiments, but they are never based on verified facts. And you will remember his counselor during the first administration became globally famous by saying, oh, we use alternative facts. There is no such thing as alternative facts. And what we have had in the Western world post-Enlightenment is the desire to have civilized discourse in our societies, to have people present their views, to have other people present their views, and then we reach a conclusion. But it all happens on the basis of facts. And sometimes we haven't been entirely successful, but there has been the ambition to debate and reach conclusions on the basis of facts. And I can tell you, when I started realizing that things were not going in a healthy direction in America, that is when local newspapers started getting into serious financial trouble and started closing. And there has been an epidemic of local newspapers having to close in the past 25 years. And what that does is that you lose the source of local news, which is what concerns most of us. And local newspapers are actually very good at reporting about local events, and local journalists are mostly very talented and do their best to establish the facts, and they will often uncover various things that are not going so well in the local community. They will also report about positive news. But what has happened in the United States as local newspapers have had to close is that people get their news via television and obviously on social media, but on television they get their news on via cable stations. And these are highly ideological news operations. They don't operate on the basis of facts. They exaggerate, sometimes they obfuscate, sometimes they flat out lie, actually on both sides of the spectrum, of the political divide. But so you get an environment of highly ideological news that is not based on facts. And Trump has taken that to a new extreme by, as a duly elected official, not showing any desire to operate on the basis of facts. What he does is he opines, and I don't know whether he believes that what he presents as facts or whether he just makes it up and says, I don't care, because I've never met the man. But that is what he does. And I was at a lunch in London earlier this week at one of the members' clubs, and the speaker was a New York businessman who is a Trump supporter and knows Trump, and he spoke for 45 minutes about the genius of Trumponomics. And for 45 minutes, he presented facts that I knew were incorrect. It was essentially figures that he just came up with. So, for example, he said, under Biden, a dozen of eggs cost $8. Now they cost $1, and I know that is not the case. But so, if you operate on that basis, that you can use, you just think of a figure. So I can say, well, under Liz Truss, a dozen eggs cost 50p, but now under Keir Starmer they cost £2. Oh, this is terrible, the Labour government. Something like that. It has no connection to reality. But if you operate like that, you create an alternative reality, right? I mean, your alternative facts lead to an alternative reality. And I think you can actually convince people that alternative reality is the reality for a while. And then they will discover after a while that actually you have been dishonest with them, or you've been lying to them, but it will take them a while. It will take a while until enough people conclude that that is the case. And I think that's where we are now in the United States.
I'd just like to move that discussion along just a little bit further on Trump with a question from Pete Gray. So, moving from the situation today, he's wondering what will be the consequence of Trump's isolationism in the next 5 to 10 years. So I think he's looking beyond the current administration and presuming that a so-called third term of Trump won't arise, or whether in fact this phenomenon of protectionism will continue. Will it be a state of permanence, or will something different happen? I think where's Pete Gray? Is that a fair summary of what you're asking? I hope so. So beyond the present term of Trump, will it change?
So what's the basic instinct, I remember there was a film in the 90s, that Trump has is that America needs more manufacturing jobs. It's just that the way he's going about it is unhelpful to America's standing in the world, because the way he goes about it is by punishing other countries into bringing those manufacturing jobs to America. And so you can say, I'm bringing manufacturing jobs to America, but if the country is not ready for it, then you are not going to achieve that growth. And what has happened, for example, in Arizona has positioned itself beautifully. Phenomenal collaboration between the state, the Chamber of Commerce, and Arizona State University in the field of chip fabs, so manufacturing of computer chips. Phenomenal collaboration, and they've managed to attract, not just on their own, but with the aid of, frankly, the Biden administration, and then now the Trump administration has come along, but they managed to attract significant investments. So companies have come along, have committed to building chip fabs, which is an extremely expensive undertaking in Arizona, only to discover that there are enough workers in Arizona to work in those factories. And not only are there not enough workers, which meant they had to postpone launching the operation of chip fabs in Arizona. There are also not enough lorry drivers. So, and if you don't have enough lorry drivers, your chips and your other products are not going anywhere. So if you just say, well, we're going to force countries and companies to invest in America, you can do that, but where are the workers going to come from? It's not going to yield the results you think if you don't have the workers who can do the work. And how are you going to get those workers? Well, it's going to be a long process. You have to convince them that working in a factory or whatever it is you're bringing is desirable. You have to train them for it, because these are not unskilled jobs. These factory jobs today are even more skilled than the jobs that left us. So you have to think of all of that, and not just think of it. You have to establish those facts for those factories that you think you're going to bring to the country to be able to operate. And that's what we saw, incidentally, if you remember the recent case involving Hyundai in Georgia. Who remembers that case from a couple of weeks ago? Yeah. So Hyundai had heeded Trump's call and, of course, was further motivated by tariffs. It heeded Trump's call to set up a factory in Georgia. It announced its commitment to setting up this factory, and which was going to then allow it to manufacture in Georgia and thus be able to sell its products without those tariffs. And so it did that, and it realized there are not enough workers in Georgia to set up this factory, because these are specialized, highly skilled jobs. So what it did was it brought workers from South Korea on temporary business visas. And you saw what happened. ICE raided the factory, or the to-be factory, and sent the workers home. You have to have a plan for where you're going to get the workers from if you want foreign companies to set up factories in your country.
Right, we're going to move on to China. Some quick answers, if you don't mind, about a big subject. We're going to a little bit of your reference to your trajectory about globalization. John Mottram, should the Chinese Belt and Road strategy not have been an early wake-up call for us? That wasn't mentioned in the talk, and he wonders whether that's a significant consideration. So you might want to say something about that, about the recent past, whereas Graham Daly is asking about the China of today and how we read that China controls 90% of the world's supply of rare earth minerals, essential for electronic devices, blah, blah. So where do we go from here, and what are the potential implications? And you don't have to answer this question, but I think it's interesting, Pete Holcroft. With the recent attacks on Marks & Spencer, Jaguar, Land Rover, and so on, he wonders whether it's your best guess that China is behind this global economic espionage. We see Chinese hand behind a lot of things these days. So there you go, Belt and Road, rare earths, cyber.
Yeah, Belt and Road seem like just another initiative, because we thought China was a country that played by the rules and was going to be collaborative. So with a country like that, why would you object to something like Belt and Road? And then we realized China was not planning to play by the rules. And yes, it took us Western countries longer than it probably should have to realize that this was essentially China tying countries into some sort of Chinese-led grouping simply because they would be beholden to China because they were part of this initiative. And I think so the awakening has come late for European countries, but the awakening is even more traumatic for the countries that are involved in Belt and Road, because what does it mean for them? It dramatically reduces their freedom of maneuver, and they thought that was something that they could sign up to because it was, it benefited their infrastructure. Well, now they're realizing they are essentially beholden to a country that may not act in their interests, never intended to act in their interests, but it seemed like a good idea at the time. But that, again, it's based on this idea that China would eventually become essentially a normal country that would obviously act in its own interests, but wouldn't wish any harm on any other country, because in the globalized economy, we all benefit if we play by the rules, if nobody behaves badly. Well, that was never China's plan. And then the second question regarding rare earths, well, that is a marquee part of globalization. So part of becoming modern economies is that we need a lot of these rare earths. They are difficult to extract, they're extremely dirty to extract. China specialized in it to the detriment of local residents who have to live with completely ruined environment, poisoned soil, toxic rivers and so forth. It's horrible. We didn't want that in our country, so it was convenient that China would specialize. As it specialized in certain parts of manufacturing, it would also specialize in rare earth processing. And so now we are discovering we are dependent on China, on the Chinese processing of rare earths. Yes, we are, but that raises the question of how are we going to process those rare earths ourselves? We know how to do it, but where would it happen? What are the local community that will declare itself willing to host rare earth processing facilities? It's going to be very dirty, very unenjoyable to live there. What are those local communities? How can we incentivize certain local communities to essentially take that one for the team and say, yeah, we are going to host it? What is the incentive going to be that a local community will need to take on that role? Because it is going to be unenjoyable, it's going to be dirty, it may even make parts of that community uninhabitable. But if we're going to liberate ourselves from this dependence on China, we need that to happen.
We'll come back to the cyber question.
And then the cyber attacks.
Can we come back to that question if we've got time?
Yeah.
Because we've only got about 10 minutes left, and I think I'd like to move on to a China-USA question. And we were talking over a meal briefly about the discussions this week between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. You might like to say something, give your thoughts on that latest discussion. David Hudson is asking, do you think the $740 billion of American debt owned by China will have affected the discussions between the two men?
I don't think so, simply because Trump is an impulsive decision maker. So he, as we know, frequently changes his mind. He operates on the basis of whether he likes the other leader, which is how Vladimir Putin has had such success. He has managed to somehow establish a rapport with Donald Trump. By the way, Kim Jong-un managed to miraculously do the same thing back in the first Trump administration. So he doesn't act on the basis of what we would call traditional considerations entertained by Western leaders. So what he does is he thinks that he can assumes that he can establish that personal rapport with the foreign leader and convince them to do whatever it is he wants them to do. But then he changes his mind, which is why we're having this sort of constant whiplash in America's trade policy vis-à-vis China, its position vis-à-vis Russia, and frankly, its position vis-à-vis our European countries, not to mention Canada. I don't know if you saw just yesterday, or was it 2 days ago, Trump imposed another, upped the tariffs imposed on Canadian goods by 10% because he had seen an ad on the telly. So it is so hard to predict the actions of a policymaker who doesn't use the traditional considerations for in formulating his positions, and also, frankly, is somebody who makes the decisions on his own. He doesn't avail himself of the expertise that traditionally Western leaders would avail themselves of. They listen to officials, they listen to cabinet ministers, and then they form their decision. He essentially forms his opinion on his own, and then his officials back him up, which is a reverse process, and it relies on him having access to correct facts, which unfortunately he often does not. So that is, I think we'll have 4 years of constant whiplash when it comes to trade policy, when it comes to the war in Ukraine, when it comes to Canada, China, North Korea, Iran, and Venezuela, any other issue of the day.
I'd like to finish off the evening by touching on the later part of your discussion, which was future globalization, what might happen in the future. And members have listened carefully, and we've got a whole series of thoughts that have come back. So if I just explore some of those with you. So, for instance, Joe Sexton, you sound really optimistic that globalization, what are you calling it, 2.0 or Mark II? What's your label?
Yeah, 2.0.
2.0. Well, Joe wonders whether your optimistic idea of 2.0 really happen, and wonders what makes you so confident that it will. Jan Ferguson, this sometimes comes up, might globalization 2.0 be women-led, and if so, what differences might that bring? That would perhaps be a little bit further in the future. Who knows? Right. Ian Watson is going to confuse us because he wants a different metric. So he thinks that globalization 1.0 was the British Empire and the USA was 2.0. So we already had 2.0, according to him. And he wonders whether globalization 3.0 will be China. In each case, in each version, it needs a dominant superpower to enforce the rules, according to him. So you might want to think about that. And Don Muir, thank you for your depiction of globalization 2.0. We said goodbye. To what should we say hello? And Tim Hiscock, it took World War II to enable the New World Order to be established, which helped globalization to emerge. What kind of crisis, so it's going to take a crisis, that we must endure before we see globalization 2.0? I'm happy to return to some of those questions if that's too much information, but you can see that you stimulated lots of different thoughts. Where would you like to start?
Yeah, I'll start actually on something I should have mentioned earlier, which is the question of trust. So what has bound Western countries together now since the end of World War II is that we have believed that we stand together, we trust one another, we have different opinions sometimes, but we trust one another, we form this family of nations, community of friends. And it was interesting when I wrote the book, one of the people one of the members of the ensemble cast of characters in this book is somebody called Keith Clark, who is he's a long-time GM executive who then became CEO of DocuSign, which the software that you use to sign documents on the internet. He then became Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs in the first Trump administration, and that meant that he got the task of fixing globalization. And how do you fix globalization? Trump knew he didn't like globalization, and it needed to be fixed. Well, how do you fix globalization? And Keith told me in this book that he realized you can't say, well, I'm going to fix globalization. You need a sort of what he called the beachhead, or one thing that you make your marquee case, and that is why America chose the battle over Huawei. Remember, it was a mighty battle. They decided not to have Huawei in U.S. government infrastructure, but they also went around telling allied countries and other countries to exclude Huawei. It was a ferocious battle here in the UK because, as you will remember, the government had decided to include Huawei. Or to permit Huawei, then the Americans told them, no, you shouldn't include Huawei. And in the end, the government had to back down. It wasn't really about Huawei. It was the Trump administration's effort to correct globalization. That's how it started. And it was based on the idea, or the idea that Keith Clark built this on was that you should have technology you can trust. It's all based on trust. And that worked because America was trusted mostly, and it could go to other countries and say, we are all countries that trust one another, we should exclude Huawei. But now, what does it mean for the United States today that other countries have decided they can no longer trust it? What does that mean for America's role in the world? It will have profound consequences for the US export economy, for American companies' ability to operate successfully in other parts of the world because they are no longer trusted. So when it comes to the next iteration of globalization, somebody told me the other day, oh, you're wrong about when the first iteration of globalization was. It was the Roman Empire. And I said, well, the Roman Empire was big, but it didn't span the whole globe. So globalization is the whole globe, and that's what we essentially got in the early 90s. Virtually every country on the earth was involved in this globalized economy in some way. Then when it comes to what comes next and why I'm optimistic because we usually learn from our mistakes, and what we'll have to have a few years where we try protectionism or more regional trade, and then people will say, well, I have an idea. Let's make it more efficient. Let's reduce consumer prices by having countries specialize in different parts of the economy, and they'll try it again because it is the most efficient solution, but it has to be accompanied by corresponding measures at home so that nobody feels left behind. And when I spoke with young people for this book, I felt so bad for them because we are leaving them with not a very good world. And there are a few young people here in this room who I should feel especially sorry for you. But it's actually not good for any of us that we are on the brink of possibly another war. We already have a land war in Europe. The rules-based international order is deteriorating, which means we'll get more anarchy in the world. Countries it will be the survival of the fittest. That is incredibly depressing, and it's so depressing that I think when we have tried it for a while, people will say not just that they think they know a better answer to economic efficiency, which is for different countries to specialize and then trade openly among themselves, but also to get along. And it's easy to say let's get along. The way to do it in an international context is to establish rules and to have countries commit to following those rules, and that will, I am convinced, be the outcome of this messy period that we are in now, and that will become messier still.
Who better than the author of Goodbye Globalisation to give us such a fascinating talk, completely without notes and with audience participation too. A tour de force. And that's been followed by a Q&A where we try to cover all the different dimensions of this slippery subject of globalization. I hope you'll all go home reflecting on everything that Elisabeth Braw has had to say, and I hope that sometime in the future she'll come back with her optimism and tell us where we've got to with globalization 2.0. Meanwhile, thank you, Elisabeth Braw. Well done.
Thank you. Forum.